Welcome to Beyond the B, an ongoing dialogue about the past, present, and future of the B Corp movement. Co-hosts Emmy Allison and Ryan Honeyman facilitate an open and honest conversation about the B Corp movement, advise companies on how to increase their impact, and provide a deep dive into the new B Corp standards that are shaping our community. Hi, it's Emmy Allison, and I'm joined by my co-host today, Ryan Honeyman. Hi, Ryan.
Hey, folks.
We have here with us today Jeffrey Stewart. Jeffrey D. Stewart is the founder and executive director of Enharmonic Encounters, a small Black-owned business that builds bridges to purposeful impact through sustainability translation, interpreting, and consulting rooted in positive social and environmental impact. As a former business sustainability analyst at B Lab Global, Jeffrey reviewed and personally conferred certification to hundreds of companies all over the world. In so doing, he employed his language skills not only in English, but also in French, Portuguese, and Spanish, making the review process more accessible and inclusive for companies in different geographic markets. In tandem with his current sustainability research as a GRI certified sustainability professional, Jeffrey's expertise equips him with a unique perspective around the inner workings, pain points, and success strategies in transforming businesses to truly embody what it means to be a certified B Corporation. Jeffrey is a B consultant and helps companies achieve B Corp certification. He also specializes in translation from Arabic into English and is currently certified by the American Translators Association for Portuguese into English. As an active interpreter, working between these same languages across in-person events, online platforms, and courtroom and legal settings, Jeffrey ensures that diverse voices receive justice in amplifying their missions and narratives. Welcome to the show, Jeffrey.
Thank you very much for the invitation. And I must say, what a pleasure it is to be here. Ever since you launched this podcast, I always thought to myself that it would be fantastic to be on one day. So I'm very privileged to make my podcast debut on Beyond the B.
We're really excited to have you. Jeffrey, before we dive into the nuts and bolts of these updates, could you share more about your journey? How did you first get involved in the B Corp movement, and what drew you personally into this work?
For me, everything began with a Fulbright grant in Brazil. I had spent the latter part of 2 years living and working in Brazil in 2 federal universities. And while I was there, I took my language learning very serious. The funny thing is, before going to Brazil, I had no plan or thought about learning Portuguese or even going to Brazil in the first place. Originally, I was applying for the grant in Jordan to put my Arabic skills to the test and immerse myself in an authentic environment. But somehow I found myself in Brazil as a Fulbright grantee instead. And while I was working in one of the federal universities there, they gave me a chance to explore my curiosities in translation. It was always something I had been thinking about toward the latter part of college and after I graduated. And through those opportunities they gave me in Brazil, I saw that translation could be a serious career prospect for me. So I decided to focus more in that area. And when the program ended, I went back home to Westchester, Pennsylvania, where I was born and raised. And I was looking for a way to launch my career with the plan that eventually I would work as a professional translator. Well, it just so happened that around that same period of time, B Lab was looking for analysts who spoke Portuguese to join the team and to conduct verification. Now, at that point in time, I knew nothing about the standards or sustainability. My college degree was in music performance, particularly orchestral music. So it was really the language piece, through the language pursuit, that I found my way to B Lab and to this great ecosystem of certified B corporations. B Lab ended up giving me a chance, and I worked as an analyst. Back then, the position was called standards analyst. In 2020, my first day, I remember very fondly, was March 3rd, 2020. And if you'll recall, 5 days later or so, we received a message that we would be out of the office in Berlin on that Friday due to health precautions because of a looming COVID-19 crisis. They said that we'll take this Friday off. We'll see you next Monday. Well, unfortunately, that Monday never came, and my entire experience in this ecosystem has pretty much been virtually since then. But nonetheless, the expertise that I gained as an analyst became very valuable in the long term. And that's ultimately what has brought us here today.
I don't think I knew any of that, or a lot of it. I shouldn't say any of it, but that's really cool. I appreciate you sharing that you sort of like came to translation first and then found B Corp. Could you tell us a little bit more about your translation work as well? How does that manifest for you in the services that you provide?
That's a great question. I'm often asked how the service of this B certification consulting and this translation or language work, what exactly is the connection there? It almost seems as if they could be two separate services within two companies, two separate legal entities. And the way I've been talking about it is that language professionals need a specialization. For example, there could be translators who focus on legal work, legal translating, or medical translating, and so on. As it happens, sustainability can also be a specialization for translation and interpreting. And of course, when it comes to B certification and addressing the standards, we become very knowledgeable and we achieve a respectable degree of control on sustainability topics. So that's really how I've been threading the needle there by saying that through our translation specialization on sustainability topics, we never leave the area of what we're doing. So whether it's through guiding companies on their B certification journey or through our language practice, we're always rooted in sustainability and we're rooted in moving toward a wider consideration of stakeholders, which is what, of course, B certification is all about.
I also have said in some of our conversations, Jeffrey, that I think in this work as B consultants, we are translators sort of in the work itself. We work to like translate the B Corp standards to like normal business and like regular terms. And so I've always seen your translation services sort of go hand in hand. You're translating B Corp standards for your clients and you're translating languages as well. You've seen this movement evolve over time. From your perspective, how has the movement matured or changed from when you first engaged with it to what we're seeing now?
When I started at B Lab back in 2020, I don't recall exactly how many certified companies there were, but I've since seen it grow significantly, whereas it used to be kind of more of a under the radar type of movement that was on the margins. And today, I still see that this ecosystem speaking from a perspective on a large scale, it still does seem a bit under the radar, and yet it has grown significantly. We're now over 10,000 certified companies globally. And probably some of the biggest change that I've witnessed over time is that this ecosystem has surged outside of the United States. One of the biggest examples in my mind is that in London alone, if I'm not mistaken, they have surged to over 1,000 just in that one metropolitan area. Whereas in Arizona or in Texas, we may see 30 certified companies, or in the case of Texas, I believe it's around 55 or so when I last checked. So I've seen this movement surge in new places, and that's really encouraging to see because this ecosystem was originally founded within a United States context. And yet today we see that it resonates greatly in non-United States contexts. And I believe that's going to be very important for us as we move forward, especially with these new standards and remaining true to a continuous commitment to impact improvement. We're going to need much more than the United States context.
A global movement.
Jeffrey, can I ask you one question so I took a year of Arabic in school, and that is a very, very difficult language. So how did you go from Portuguese to Arabic? How does that story go?
Right. That's another one of those questions that seems to fascinate many people when I talk about what I'm able to do and how I've developed over the years. Originally, my pursuit was only on Arabic. That's something that I began studying as a third year college student. And that curiosity came up for me back when I was a second year college student. I had taken a trip to London with other students, and we took a tour of the School of Oriental African Studies in London. And we met with some of the doctoral students there who presented on their research around Arab and Muslim affairs. At that point in time, I knew very little, close to nothing about that region of the world. And something about that presentation sparked something in me, something that gave me a sudden desire to want to know more, to understand that region of the world better. And what that meant for me ultimately is that I would want to talk to people on the ground. So I would have to speak Arabic. When I became a third year college student, I finally had the chance to start doing that. And as I've learned about myself, language learning is something that I can really leverage, something that it's kind of an intersection between a passion that I have and something that can actually be leveraged professionally. So that's really the needle I was trying to thread in part. And with learning Arabic toward the end of college, I started hearing about these Fulbright grants. That could be a good way for me to get abroad because I didn't have the opportunity to do a traditional study abroad program. So they told me about the Fulbright opportunity in Jordan specifically. And unfortunately, that application was unsuccessful. And I was actually quite stunned at that result because I thought my application was very strong and I would have been an ideal candidate for the program. But somehow, late in the game, the Fulbright Commission in Brazil informed all applicants that they had made additional positions available in their program. So for all applicants who had applied elsewhere and were unsuccessful, they would now have the chance to reapply for the program in Brazil specifically. And I figured that even though I had never thought about Brazil or Portuguese, the Fulbright name is still very prestigious. So I should consider it and I should try to pursue that route. And they ended up giving me a chance. And that chance changed my life entirely. I had never spent as much time abroad anywhere as I did in Brazil. And to this day, I still go back often. And with so much in-country experience, of course, language learning, I really connected it there. And that's how Portuguese became an integral part of my practice.
Love it. I was wondering if the CIA tried to recruit you because anyone who knows Arabic, it's like they're going to say, "Hey, do you want to come work for Uncle Sam?"
Well, I can't say that. I wouldn't consider it if they presented an offer.
Fair enough. You're like, actually, I'm undercover right now. Well, Emmy, do you want to frame up this conversation and why we're chatting today and what we hope to cover?
Sure. Yeah. 2026 is the year that the new standards version 2.1, which we're now calling hot off the presses version 2. Version 2 standards are getting applied. Like companies have the opportunity to actually submit and be verified against the new standards in this year. And so B Lab as a global network is really focusing on skilling up the community. I mean, there has been a lot last year, but the term rubber meeting the road has come up a lot lately. So there's like a lot of new information that someone earlier today said something like drinking from the fire hose, it feels like. But we are here today to talk about the latest updates in the auditing process. We've learned a lot more about what the audit process for B Corp certification will look like, thanks to some webinars that B Lab has hosted with the audit partners, 2Cert and SCS. And yeah, we've got a lot more information about that. And that's what we'll be focusing on today. But I think we should probably make sure that folks towards the end of the episode are aware of all of the resources, the upskilling opportunities there are for the community coming up this year. I think we'll start with the website just because it is still very much a go-to and sort of folks figuring out where to start or the right places to go. The B Lab global website, which is bcorporation.net, has more information about the certification process. And I think it's like more holistic. Before it was kind of just like a lot of blog posts and updates daisy chain together, but the B Lab staff zoomed out, reorganized the information, and now it's easier to sort through what you need quicker. The way that to get to it, and I try to we're back to translation. I try to translate or sort of help people find the breadcrumbs wherever possible. B Lab is referring to it as the certification hub, but if you go to the website currently, it's not really called that. I think you would go to the standards part of the menu, and then a drop down pops up and there's explore the B Lab standards, and then there's certifying on the B Lab standards, and that's where you'll find the certification hub. So just in case folks are like, where I saw this, I don't know how to find it, that's how you find it. Jeffrey, do you have any reactions on the new certification hub and the way that B Lab has reorganized this information, I guess, at a high level?
Indeed. I see the new certification hub as a positive development on B Lab's part in an attempt to be as transparent as possible around all of the information and all of the detail points related to version 2 of the standards for B certification. One of the biggest pain points I've heard in general throughout the years, whether as a consultant or even as a former analyst, is that information seems to be siloed, or information is not readily available for companies to access and use on their B certification journeys. And that could have been related either to specific questions in the assessment or to protocols on how B Lab operates, or even to what analysts are doing in their diligence. So I believe B Lab recognizes that this transition is crucial from the standpoint of we need companies to have access to as many resources as possible to ensure that they are as equipped as possible to remain compliant with these new standards and to retain their status in this ecosystem. That's a great start that they're making with this certification hub, and specifically to house all of the resources in one place. I believe they may view it as a one-stop shop, if you will, for anything related to these standards. And also when updates are published, they would also go on this certification hub. So in general, it's a great move forward on B Lab's part to promote transparency and to ensure that all of the resources that they have available are indeed within easy access to all companies.
Yeah, and I will add that the certification hub, I think, is a little bit more geared towards companies applying for certification, like initial certification. But I do think that it's probably best in this transition to the new standards to just start over from scratch. I also appreciate they have some context built into the certification hub. How did we get here? But there's also lots of different resources and guides. Ryan, did you have any reactions, or did you want to add anything?
Yeah, I'm curious, Jeffrey, what you think about, one of the announcements is there's two platforms. There's the digital audit platform now, and then there's B Impact. And there's potentially some AI enhanced auditing before it even goes to a human auditor, like AI will look at it. And so what do you think about the upsides and downsides of having these two different platforms and then sort of AI component added to the process?
I thought it was a rather fascinating development, especially with the second platform that they announced, the auditing platform, and that when companies provide all of their documentation in order to request the audit, all of that documentation would then be transferred to an auditing platform. And I understand that on that platform, there would be some AI being leveraged to facilitate the protocol or to better organize things from the auditing end. I'm not too sure how the AI implementation will be best leveraged. If anything, perhaps it could promote a type of maybe standardization in how documentation is prepared in order to be recognizable or acknowledged by whatever AI tools are being used. But in general, I suppose that it could streamline some things for the audit process, which I'm sure companies wouldn't mind, given what the period of time that could be needed for the complete audit to be realized, depending on conformities or whether some type of remediation is needed in the middle of the audit.
Yeah, the presence of AI in this process is surprising, but also sort of not, in that certification is very expensive, as I think we've covered on this podcast. And we've heard in the B Corp community, certification fees are not cheap, and a large portion of them go toward verification. So I'd imagine this is an opportunity for this whole sort of ecosystem to try to keep costs to be a bit more reasonable. I also wanted to clarify, so there's the B Impact assessment or the B Impact platform, and then the B Digital Audit platform. The B Impact assessment or the B Impact platform is where we are uploading documentation as a company's applying for a certification or recertification. And then that data or that documentation gets like handed over to the B Digital Audit platform. And that audit platform is where the actual audit and verification happens. That's the same for all sizes, right? It's like from company without workers up to extra, extra large.
Correct. That's my understanding, that that transfer would happen irregardless of size.
And I think also what's new here, what Jeffrey was saying, yeah, the documentation is required up front. And that is what is required to even signal to B Lab that you're ready for your audit. I think there's also something in there, don't quote me on this, y'all. When you submit all your documentation and you signal, you say to B Lab, there's like something we sign, and you say to B Lab, we're ready. I don't think there are that many more opportunities to upload more documentation after that, after you say you're ready. And so just make sure that you have everything together and it's all ready to go when you do that.
Right. That's a very big difference or update with these new standards being implemented, is that with the former version of the standards, very little documentation will be uploaded prior to the actual verification or the audit, as it's now being called. Companies would only upload documentation for questions that were specifically requested to do so. Whereas now, the standards, we have a blanket set of requirements that we all must meet. And so we're going to have to upload documentation to satisfy all of those impact topics and all of those standards before we can even request the audit. So that is a major change. And my understanding at present is that when we're actually uploading materials, it would have to be some kind of document, or I remember a question being asked on one of the recent webinars, what if documentation is being provided via a link instead of an actual PDF or upload? How would that look? And my understanding to date is that it would be preferred for the actual document to be uploaded.
That makes sense. And that's a good clarifying question. I think the other thing to note here for listeners is that the specific details, I'm like, you got to double check, especially based on your size and all that jazz. But B Lab is requesting that you are submitting your documentation at minimum 30 days in advance of the time you want to start the audit. That's, I think, less applicable outside of the ECGT. The company is subject to ECGT, but that's also something I think that's helpful to keep in mind in terms of the timeline that you're preparing yourself to implement these new things, provide documentation, upload it, and then mentally prepare yourself for the audit.
I'm curious, Jeffrey, you sat in on the 2Cert informational webinar, which for listeners, that's a subsidiary of Ganeshtim, who's going to be handling the small micro certifications on the new standards. And then you also sat in on the SCS Global Services, which will be handling medium and higher size. And I'm curious if anything stood out to you, maybe about those presentations or differences maybe between the two, how they'll be handling it, or anything that could be helpful for folks to know about.
When it comes to the actual audit process and the steps that will be taken after submission, that protocol seemed pretty uniform for the most part. That there was one mention of how long we should expect this audit to take, for companies with no workers versus maybe a large company? Could there be some difference in the duration? Ultimately, as is the answer with many things from B Lab, it depends on, yes, size, but something I noticed that I believe, will begin to appreciate more over time is how the duration can be affected by the presence of nonconformities, whether minor or major. For minor nonconformities, or whether it's minor or major, there will be a corrective action report, and there must be steps taken on the part of the company to address these corrective actions. Now, as we learned, for minor nonconformities, companies are still able to advance to the end of the audit without fully resolving them beforehand. But for major nonconformities, they will need to be closed prior to being awarded this certificate for B certification and then moving on to the licensing. So working on closing those major nonconformities, that's essentially what we have known as an improvements period on the former standards. That could take up to 6 months. For example, they're looking at giving a period of some 6 months to 6 to 12, if I'm not mistaken, to close those major nonconformities. If you reach that point, that could extend your audit time up through that same duration, another 6 or 12 months, yet you haven't completed that certification cycle yet. So that could draw things out a lot more for companies than it has in the past. Otherwise, I didn't see too many differences in how they're going to address the audit steps. One of the biggest things I took away is that we have to upload all of our documentation in the very beginning before anything happens on B Lab's part. And then we have to request the audit to begin. In sending that request, there has to be some logistics handled and scheduling and things that happen beforehand before that audit begins. So really, we may be looking at it from an aspect of getting ourselves organized more on the front end than we may have done in the past. Those are probably some of the biggest takeaways I have from both of those webinars.
Yeah, so just looking at some notes here, like major and minor nonconformities, just for folks, it looks like, just to define, minor is something like an isolated lapse in control that doesn't indicate a total system breakdown. I imagine there's something like having a policy, but maybe it's not posted in the right place. And like, okay, we just got to make sure to post it in the right place to get credit on the assessment. Whereas a major nonconformity is like a red flag, human rights violations, lack of fair wages. But this is new. I mean, B Corp logo misuse. Is that right? Jeffrey, can you confirm that was stated?
I was also surprised by that.
How about that logo misuse? That sounds right. And one of the directions that they're advancing on is, with the logo use, the expanded questioning or ensuring that the branding is being used on the specific brands within the scope of certification. Even now, as this transition is underway, B Lab is asking a lot more about the websites and the branding where companies wish the logo to be used. Because if they want to use that branding on a website that is different than the actual name of the company or the name that was approved as within scope, then that would trigger additional reviews on B Lab's part. Historically, they would conduct a brand review to determine eligibility for that branding, for the B Corp logo to be used on the different branding. I'm not sure if that protocol would change at all with the new standards. I don't recall hearing much about specifically a brand review process as it is known today. But in any case, they're certainly stepping up on the misuse.
Yeah, to me, originally, if this is part of the audit, it looks like it's like, I don't know, put the B Corp logo upside down. I don't know. But it's actually more what Jeffrey is saying is, in the case of multiple brands, multiple entities, that the logo is only approved for, a specific application in the scoping process. And that's, I think, more along the lines. But there also is the, if you don't know this yet, there's a new logo that includes the URL. What is it? bcorp.com? So yes, I would imagine also if you are not using the correct logo.
You didn't see the Super Bowl ad about bcorp.com?
I actually missed that.
Oh,
And I guess
it was the first commercial in the Super Bowl. So,
maybe that explains it. I was not watching that part. Jeffrey and I actually watched the Super Bowl together. So I think we missed that. Or I missed that part. Maybe Jeffrey was paying attention.
it was on Bad Bunny's jersey, actually, bcorp.com on the back.
Can you imagine? Bad Bunny, it's a B and a B. The other thing I wanted to say about minor versus major nonconformities is that the PowerPoints, the slide decks, or at least the one from SCS, has some pretty decent and specific examples of what a major nonconformity could look like and what a minor nonconformity could look like. So I would recommend that folks look through that slide deck, watch that webinar.
We'll post that in the show notes just so folks have it.
Okay, excellent. I was like, I don't know where people would find that.
We'll find it. We'll track it down. Put it in the show notes.
Well, I'm also curious, but where does B Lab post stuff like that? But we'll see how that goes. The other thing I'll say too, I'm not 100% sure of this, but I think some of the nonconformities get folded into like the surveillance audits and all that jazz. So for some of the larger companies, medium, large, extra large, and depending on the sector, the audit schedule sometimes will be annual. So make sure you figure that out. If you haven't already seen, everyone's going to get evaluated on year zero requirements. But then after that, the pathways diverge quite a bit. Sometimes it's just year zero, year 5. Sometimes it's year 0, year 3, year 5. And sometimes there's year 0, surveillance audit 1, surveillance audit 2, year 3.
Right. And speaking of the different requirements, one of the other really big takeaways from those webinars from SCS Global and 2Cert was the timeline that is applicable to the ECGT companies in our ecosystem. Maybe because I wasn't paying as much attention to it before because it doesn't apply to us at Enharmonic Encounters, but for companies where it does apply, their timeline is coming up very quickly. They urged on both of those webinars that those companies would ideally submit certification on these new standards by May 15th, and they're giving an absolute deadline of July 15th, I believe, to ensure that they can, if not fully get through the audit, at least be well into it in time for the ECGT deadline, September 26th of this year. So that's quite fast. I mean, we're entering into March now, so they really just have a few months to get organized. And I know that there may not be that many companies in the grand scheme of things that have to do it in time for those deadlines, but it's really getting down to the wire, and that these standards are here and they will begin to be implemented quickly.
Yes. Again, definitely make sure you check your specific size, sector, part of the world, global partner, all that jazz, your region. But yes, the deadlines for ECGT, companies that are subject to ECGT are really coming up, and B Lab is encouraging folks to submit as soon as possible.
Do you want to say something about this legal waiver?
Yes, I think it would have to be one of you two.
Yes, that's a good point. The legal waiver, they made a point to talk about this legal waiver in those webinars. That legal waiver is connected to that July 15th deadline I just mentioned for the ECGT companies. I believe that waiver is something that companies could opt into signing, but they have until July 15th in order to decide whether they will sign it or not. And the reason I believe they gave that deadline is because they want to ensure that companies fulfill their commitments to the ECGT directive in time for its application at the end of September. And I guess that legal waiver is an acknowledgement by B Lab on whether they're able to meet it in time, or maybe it takes liability away from B Lab in order for companies to get certified in time.
I think it's worth just saying, I've talked to some folks at B Lab, and I think it's important to mention that ECGT, the European regulations, have really forced B Lab's hand in a lot of ways to do a lot of things very quickly that may seem kind of rushed or jumbled to like a sort of an outside observer, be like, why would they do that? And so I think I've come to appreciate how much of the last 2 years, 3 years, et cetera, because I think we've known generally that these European regulations are coming into place for maybe 3 years or so, but like how much of this new process and like the choices and things like the sort of reason that B Lab hasn't done impact business models initially, and the reason that B Lab hasn't done a point scale or like a sort of high, like B Corp platinum, gold, or silver. Like it's just a lot of this has been the realization that like European regulators are going to come in and be like, okay, you say this company is best for the world, or some of the older language, they're like, show me exactly how you calculate that and what your reasoning is. And it has to hold up to that legal scrutiny. And so B Lab has had to be like, okay, we need to like really simplify everything and do all these steps to get prepared. And so I guess I'm just voicing that I've always seen like a lot of different pressures and things and tensions going on in the B Corp movement. But I think in particular, the empowering consumers for the green transition, ECGT, European laws have really been like a huge part of everything. And I don't know, Jeffrey, if you have anything to add on that, or does that resonate with you?
It does. It does a great deal. It really seems that way, that B Lab is moving toward that new directive from the European Union. And it really has affected the entire framework of these new standards. One of the biggest themes of it all is the separation between B Lab as an entity and the actual standards, or the auditing of the standards. B Lab used to conduct that entire process in-house with, first, as they were called, standards analysts, and then naming them business sustainability analysts. And then throughout recent years, that whole part of the process was taken out of B Lab and given to a third party in an attempt to create more separation. Well, with this European framework now, the degree of separation needs to be undeniable. And that separation needs to also be aligned with standards, ISO standards, if I'm not mistaken, right? The auditing partner has to be aligned with those international standards. And so you see it as well in the actual certification and licensing. With these new standards, B Lab isn't even sending out the actual certificate anymore for when companies complete the auditing process with a positive outcome, meaning they're successful in the audit. B Lab isn't even issuing that certificate anymore. That's going to be done by the auditing partners, SCS Global and 2Cert, and then B Lab will remain in control of the licensing piece. That's really, this European framework is even revolutionizing B Lab's role. I see it more as a role of cultivating a global movement, whereas before, yes, it was cultivating a global movement, but also safeguarding the standards and innovating on the standards however they could. But now the safeguarding piece and the implementation piece of these standards is taken away totally from B Lab. So that's going to look different moving into the future. And I'm curious to see how B Lab continues to evolve with it, specifically with the piece on cultivating this global ecosystem to be even larger than it is today.
Yeah, I think ECG really emphasizes like a hard underline on standards, and it's just like a standardization of the standards. And this means the same thing across every single size, sector, industry, region. And all stakeholders are really clear on what it means and what it doesn't mean. And I think that's a great thing for being on the same page about what is a B Corp. But to make it actually happen is quite an undertaking. I spoke a little bit earlier about the audit's life cycle. The new audit life cycle is now a 5-year basis, and we have become accustomed to the 3-year sort of turnover. And then before that, it was 2 years. So it's really, we're sort of stretching. It's a whole different way about going about fulfilling the standards. And we talked about the year 0, year 3, year 5. requirements and then the surveillance audits as well. But this is a whole different process. I think it's kind of cool because it does sort of require folks to think about it more regularly and then on a longer time horizon. And I think too, folks were worried about feasibility for a while, and the year 03 versus 3 versus 5 allows a bit of flexibility in fulfilling the all total 100% standards. But do you have any thoughts about how companies might think about this differently, Jeffrey, or do you have any sort of reactions to the 5-year versus 3?
With the 5-year approach now, given that there will be a lot more activity in between, not just on the 5th year, I believe it will go a long ways to promote the true essence of continuous impact improvement. That phrase, continuous impact improvement, is one that we hear a lot in this ecosystem. B Lab mentions that specific wording in a lot of its official language, but I don't believe we've really seen it over time to the degree that we would like. With the former version of the standards, you didn't really need to implement continuous improvement. You just had to show something on that specific year before the recertification or on that year. There was no real mechanism of accountability in the 1 or 2 years in between that original 3-year cycle. So I believe that was one of the main pain points that played a role in the development of these new standards. Now, what the aim is that we want companies to remain engaged and committed to this journey of impact improvement over time. That's why there will be some kind of audit in year 3, or depending on the company size. It could be some kind of surveillance every year, and then getting to the actual recertification on the 5th year. And in general, specifically for companies that are already certified, that are going to certify, if you will, for the first time on these new standards, part of the year 3 and the year 5 requirements, part of that reasoning, to my understanding, is that it would allow more of a smoother transition for currently certified companies to then align with the new standards. One of the biggest manifestations of it is when it comes to clients in controversial industries. That's been a hot topic for certified companies for a few years now. And these new standards take more of a solid stance, if you will, on serving clients in controversial industries. But as we know, it's not always something that companies can change quickly, when that could be something that needs to phase out slowly over a few years. So in that specific example, B Lab is saying that companies have actually until year 3 to comply with that specific piece on the controversial industries. That's for currently certified companies only, versus for companies seeking new certification for the very first time, then they would be required to comply on year 0 right away. So those are some of what I see around that 5-year horizon, when it comes to having the little bit of surveillance in those years in between, and how the different checkpoints are being used, in my vision, how they would be used for companies on their journey.
Yeah, I think I will add that when I was at B Lab US and Canada, I definitely saw my fair share of B Corps who came to recertification. It was quite evident the folks who hadn't thought about it since their last cert versus the folks who were working on it actively and continuously throughout that 3-year period. And I think that this process, just kind of requires folks to really think about their impact year over year. So we'll see how that manifests. I think it will be really interesting too if people are thinking about it more frequently. Maybe people are sharing more about what they're working on, and some of the impact might become a lot more visible, but we'll see how that goes.
So Jeffrey, I have a bit of a random question for you. When you were an analyst during that, because I think it was March 2020 through 2021, right, that you actually worked for B Lab. So there was a lot of companies, especially by June 2020, that were coming in hot, right? Like you were just Did you ever get a sense that there were bad actors? Like a company was actually trying to get certified that actually with like malicious intent or anything? Or was it more that it was companies who were maybe like trying to certify, but they just really weren't as impactful as they thought they were and that they couldn't certify? So yeah, I guess I'm always curious from an analyst side, did you ever see companies that you're like, wow, this is a really suspicious company that's actually trying to certify? Did that ever happen to you?
Not that I can tell from that angle of possible malicious intent or suspicious activity. Probably what was more salient at that point in time was the increasing backlog that was on all of our minds. With the extremely long holding patterns that companies were in more and more without much contact on B Lab side or without maybe as many updates as companies would have liked. That phenomenon was omnipresent, and the attempt to meet all of that demand, it came off to me as more significant or more something that sticks with me even to this day. I don't recall that I saw many instances of suspicious activity. It's probably more of what we see as consultants, in that companies submit and do have great practices, but don't always have the level of formality that the review requires.
That's reassuring. I didn't know if during that high period. I imagine B Lab has had some companies who are trying to get certified but are not authentic. And so that's good to hear. Well, what if we shifted to looking forward a little bit? Let's imagine a company has a recert date of like 2027, because I do know a lot of companies had 2026 recertification dates and now they're pushed into 2027. There's probably a lot of companies listening that have this, or 2028. So let's say it's 2027, like
April.
You're going April 2027. Okay. April 2027. So 13 months away. What should they be doing, in your opinion, Jeffrey, in the next, say, 6 months? Can they do nothing for 6 more months and then make it on time? Do they need to be screaming and running around in circles because they're already behind? Or what do you recommend?
I certainly wouldn't encourage companies to remain stagnant for the next 6 months, in that, timelines seem to approach much quicker than we expect, especially now that, with the present state of the economy, many of us are thinking about running our businesses and remaining financially viable, probably maybe a little bit more than before. So our minds can be easily distracted on other things. And yet, with these new standards, we must begin to take action, I would say, as soon as possible. Even for companies due in 2027, that's going to be coming around the corner in short order. So one of the first things to do in order to get started, companies need to understand what's being required of them. I know the new platform seems daunting, or companies may not be sure how to navigate the platform. And that's certainly something new that may require a little bit of time. But in any case, it's important to understand that even when you see all of these requirements, all of these sub-requirements and numbers and things, they're not all required to be completed by the company. In some cases, it might just show a complete list of actions that could be taken, but the company may only need to implement one or two from that list. So it's important to understand the specific requirements for your company. Obviously, that's going to vary widely depending on the size and the sector. And then it's important to understand where you may already be meeting requirements. It's very possible that companies are already compliant in many areas, but then they need to identify the areas where some type of improvement would be needed. A lot of companies and colleagues talk about conducting a gap analysis as a healthy exercise to identify those areas and then create a roadmap for implementation. That roadmap could include a number of actions, and some of those actions may not be able to be implemented overnight. There may need to be some runway to make certain adjustments and changes. And it's for that reason that we say that it's important to get started as early as possible. And then even once the year zero requirements are completed, we're not done there. As we said earlier, one of the biggest points of evolution with these standards is that not going to remain still, if you will. Yes, we're going to meet the year zero requirements, but then looking forward toward year 3 and year 5, there may well be additional requirements that must be met that were not levied in year zero. And for that reason and many more, we really need to start by educating ourselves, whether it be through the support of a consultant or through your own internal teams. It's important simply to understand what we need to do first, and then we can make a plan to get there accordingly.
Log into that B Impact platform, folks. That's the best place to start because it will filter for you what your year zero requirements are. Also, you should probably check your track too while you're at it. Size, sector, industry, all that jazz.
Log into the beep and don't sleep on the BDAC.
BDAP. B-Lab is slightly frustrated with us. But we all use acronyms. Jeffrey, where can listeners find more information about your work and what is something that you need right now?
Thank you very much. It's always an important question to highlight. What I need most is for all companies in our great ecosystem to know that in spite of the anxiety or the fears that they may be experiencing around these new standards, support is available. There are colleagues committed to assisting companies on their journey, whether at Lyft Economy or at Enharmonic Encounters or at any other firm or consulting agency within our network. Support is available, and we want to see you succeed and retain your status in this ecosystem. Through this transition, I've come to realize more than ever that we really are interdependent on each other, as they state in the declaration. And so that is shining through more than ever in this moment. For us at Enharmonic Encounters, we will be thrilled to connect with you and discuss any specifics or questions you may have via our website at enharmonicenc.com. We want you to engage with us and hold us accountable on our own journey, whether through our consulting work or our charitable giving initiatives or through our language services. We're here to support you however we can, and we'll be looking forward to connecting with you.
I think this is also probably a good opportunity to either remind folks or let folks know that, again, there are so many wonderful opportunities to get more familiar and get more comfortable with the new standards with version 2.1. I know that B-Lab US and we are most familiar with B-Lab US and Canada's offerings because our companies are based in the US, but I know that B-Lab US and Canada is offering or launching a series called the Standard Sprint, launching on March 4th. And that's like a weekly gathering opportunity to learn about the standards. And then I think most importantly, connect with your peers, either in your size or sector industry, on how other folks are applying the standards and what some of their tips and tricks are. So that's happening again, starting March 4th, weekly through June. And then, as always, be sure to keep an eye on the calendar. There's also definitely going to be more global events and then other region specific events. Check the Beehive, check your global partners offerings. But yeah, we are definitely in this together. And there are resources out there to help you achieve these new standards. I think it also makes sense to mention that the Champions Retreat, the B Corp Champions Retreat, is coming up at the end of April. It's April 21st through 23rd. But there's events happening all that week. Definitely come through Milwaukee, Wisconsin. I'm personally really excited about Milwaukee. And yeah, there will just be a ton of great programming. And Champions Retreat is quite focused on applying the new standards, version 2. And yes, we'll be learning a lot. We'll be getting a lot of like technical information from B Lab and the global network, but then there again are also opportunities to collaborate with other B Corps as well and to be figuring this out together.
And even if you're not a US Canada B Corp, you can still come to that. There's actually, I know a number of folks from around the world who are coming to the retreat in Milwaukee.
We would be delighted. I love meeting folks from B Corps from around the world at Champions Retreat. It is such a treat, truly. And then I think the other thing to remember is that the level applications are coming up. They're due March 23rd, I believe, 2026. And if you know businesses out there that are owned by folks who identify as or who are underrepresented in the business community, definitely check out more information about that. You could find that on the B Lab US and Canada website level program, and then you can find the application there as well.
And we'll put it in the show notes.
Yes, exactly.
We'll have all the links.
Indeed. Thank you so much for joining us, Jeffrey. It was such a delight to have you on.
Yeah.
Thank you again. Thank you so much for the invitation. It was an honor to not only have made my podcast debut, but to have done it on Beyond the B. I'm an avid listener, and I truly admire everything you do. May it be the first of many for us.
Yay.
Inshallah.
Thanks, Jeffrey.
Inshallah.
Hey, Beyond the B listeners. If you're looking for even more inspiring conversations with leaders on the front lines of our movement towards just futures, be sure to subscribe to Next Economy Now, produced by the team at Lift Economy. Next Economy Now broadens the focus beyond the B Corp movement to highlight the leaders who are taking a regenerative, bioregional, democratic, equitable, racially just, and whole systems approach to creating the new economy. Check out our latest episodes at lifteconomy.com/podcast. You can subscribe to Next Economy Now on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts.